Hello and welcome. Today we're going to wrap up the class, we're going to put everything together, and we're going to discuss cultural competency. Again, the goal of this class is not to be an anthropological genius where you know the ins and outs of every single culture there is, because there are so many cultures on this planet in so many countries and different ethnicities. It would be very hard to cover all of that ground in if we sat here and took classes every day for the rest of our life. And that's the beauty of it. That's why it's a whole field with, thousands and thousands of people jumping in to give us information, to help us clue us in, to give us the tools we need to better understand people. The idea of this class and the idea of cultural competency is to begin to understand other people's perspectives, where they're coming from, their personal experiences. How does society work? How does that influence them? How does the brain work in the way they think? And how does the society they grew up in influence the way they think? How is our heritage, our ethnicity going back millennia? How does that influence everything about who we are? And then how do we apply that to health and illness and the healthcare system and treatment? So, again, the goal of this class is to not become aware of every single detail about every culture. That takes many, many years just to even crack the surface. The idea is to be able to think about things by removing our own personal bias, by considering that maybe there's more to the story that we need to delve into to best treat people, for example. Some people, for example, if they have a culture that is sensitive to talking too much or talking about taboo issues, for example. Someone who is a nurse who needs that information to be able to better help them. How do we approach that person and make them feel comfortable and make them feel warm and make them feel like we understand where they're coming from? And how do we communicate to better help them and to better serve them? Okay. So again, the goal of cultural competence is to simply be aware that the world is very dynamic and it is multicultural, and people are coming from all kinds of different directions. And regardless of that, we have to help them. And so, how do we help them? How do we understand where they are coming from? This is the idea of cultural competency. And it's a neat course because it's catered toward the medical community. So, what we're talking about is the idea of introducing ideas that you might find in a sociology class, like prejudice and discrimination and poverty, and how does that affect your life, and then apply that to the medical sciences, okay? But this is incredibly important because how are we going to understand access to healthcare if we don't understand the social class system, in which there's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and all the social classes in between, and you have social inequality where some people don't have a lot of money and they don't have a great education and they don't have a great job. And then how does this affect not only their health, but also their access to health care? Okay. And then where are these people coming from? What's their personal perspectives? So, the goal is to discuss the rationale for becoming culturally competent. This is one of the major objectives of this class, and that's what we're talking about. Again, it's not about knowing every single thing about every culture because that would be impossible. It's about trying to get at where other people are coming from to better understand how we can help them. And then that's the idea of embracing the heritage chain, of cultural care, is how do you be aware of other people? We need to also describe the components of cultural care circle. And the idea of this is this everything that we've been talking about. How do we get to know their heritage and their attitudes toward health and illness? And then how are the both of those associated? Then we're also going to talk about goals for integrating cultural competency in the scope of practice. And again, when you have a patient, how do we get to that patient? How do we open that line of communication? How do we all work together to solve common problems, which is, preventing illness and treating illness and then maintaining health, okay? Based upon an individual's perspective of health. So again, the heritage train is a big part of what we've been talking about this whole book. And again, the heritage chain is everything we're talking about. This idea of how do we understand where a person's coming from. In order to do that, I need to know their biology. I need to know how their genetics works and how their body works. I also need to understand the brain structure and how people think and their cognitions. And I also have to understand everything about the social context. So again, to know a person truly, you have to know their body, the mind, and then everything they've ever experienced in their life, the whole social context. And it's incredibly diverse. So, again, we're looking at some of the major core things that influence people, such as religion and family and country of origin and, overall ethnicity and race, despite, race being a social construct. So, again, the idea of heritage chain is recognizing a person's heritage, their genealogy, where they're coming from, where's their cultural value system, how did their culture evolve, diversity, how many different cultures are there, and then how are all these cultures stratified and significantly different from each other. Health panoramas, again, including the genetics and the body and the typical experiences that one might come based upon their genetics, and then attitudes toward health and illness. And again, you have to look at it from a pre-industrial time to an industrial time to a postmodern time like we have today, incorporating also attitudes of spirituality on top of science and on top of history and all the things we used to do before we had modern technology, which still linger, as the book has demonstrated. So again, cultural competency requires understanding the heritage chain. I don't have to know everything about everybody, but I need to know a little bit about where people are coming from. I kind of like to think about it as like a, jack of all trades, if you wish. Not that you're ever going to know everything about it, but you can kind of dabble in everything because you have some experience, okay? So again, we need to be asking when we're dealing with the public and we're dealing with this in a medical field, how did we get here? Is what we should be asking about the person, how did they get here? Like, um, and then we need to be asking, why is society the way it is? Like, okay, so think about somebody with a minority status. How did they get here? How did they get a minority status? Why is it we live in a society where people have minority status? Okay, and then where are people coming from? Like we talked about Native Americans' fear of white doctors. And again, that, every whenever I mention something like that, that sticks with me. It makes me ask a lot of questions. But again, where is that coming from? In order to understand that, I have to understand the entire experience of Native Americans, which again, we've talked a little bit about, but it's very deep, rich cultural history, and a lot of it's so sad and dark, on top of the beauty of the civilization, of course. So again, what are other people's perspectives of health, illness? Okay, where are they coming from? And then what's their attitude toward the system? And then how does the system itself affect their life? Okay, how does growing up in poverty affect your life? Middle class values or upper class values? Again, what are people's personal experiences and how do we get at some of these? So, it's uncomfortable to ask a lot of questions. Like sometimes you don't want to ask such specific things. But what you can get at is opening up the door so they feel more comfortable talking about what needs to be talked about so that we can help them in some ways, form or fashion. Okay? We need to understand where people their cultural how what kind of culture they were socialized into, because if we can better understand the culture they're socialized into, we can get a better feel for how they approach health and illness, and then how we can better help them, because some people, for example, are uncomfortable talking about things, which is why men, for example, seek medical help less than women. So why is that? Why is there a disparity between male culture and female culture, and that males go seek help less? Okay, so again, it's could just be these macro constructs, such as male or female and race and ethnicity, all will influence our attitudes. And but it's also the small things, like, did you grow up in Indiana versus Texas versus Albania? And then how does that influence your attitudes toward things? Okay. So again, we need to be asking, how were people socialized? What kind of a culture were they socialized into? And then you have to turn that on yourself in the end. In order to really do the job well, you have to remove your personal bias. And again, your knowledge and your own personal experiences are tools, However, we can't let things cloud our judgment. So we always, as a researcher, for example, have to remove ourselves from the equation and try to understand other people's subjective experiences as they're telling it to us. Because, yes, we're going to be interpreting and coming up with the themes of what they're saying, but still, we don't want to put our own words on it. We need to know where other people are coming from, so we have to hear their words. And then we have to find a way to make them comfortable to be able to communicate in such a way. And again, this is the idea of cultural care, is recognizing that there are things out there like poverty, and you might suggest a surgery. But then you got to be wondering what kind of economic pressure is that imposing on a family? And so again, how do we manage the situation? What can we do in that situation? Because again, that's somebody wants a surgery, they can't afford it, the system's not going to give it to them because they can't afford it. What can we do? How can we recognize that situation? What other outlets do we have? Can we involve social workers? Can we get grants? What can we do? There are so many ways that we can help, from the administrative side all the way to the patient care side. There's a lot to it. Again, it's a broad field, but again, cultural competency is again about being able to embrace the idea that there is these diverse heritages and diversity of cultures, and not everybody has a fair shot, and just things like that. All right. So, why must healthcare providers, nurses, physicians, public health and social workers, and other healthcare professionals study culture, ethnicity, religion, and become culturally competent? Again, this is so we can better help people. The more aware you are of where people are coming, the easier it is to interact, the better we can all work together to make everything happen. Again, it's basic symbolic interactionism. We use language, for example, to communicate and work together as a team. But what do you do if language doesn't work? Because there's different languages and not everybody might speak your same language, for example. What can we do? Again, it's a mandate that we go find someone to communicate for us in some way. And if there's not a linguistic, we start with pictures and Pictionary, I don't know, some way from there, but one way or another, we will find a way to work with people. That's the goal. Okay, because everything's not going to match up, and we need to understand where they're coming from. My first introduction to the idea of being afraid of um like I was watching a Law and episode when I was a kid, Law and Order, and it was an episode where this religious sect didn't believe in modern medicine, so they didn't give their child the medicine that could have saved its life. And then it was up to Jack McCoy, of course, to then prosecute this family. But then you had to ask this question because you had this conflict between religion and modern health and medicine. And so, that's one of my first introductions to this idea that not everybody necessarily buys into this modern way of thinking, for example. And that's just one area. Why must we know the differences between hot and cold and yin and yang, as the book talked about with Native Americans and Mexicans and Asian people? And they have this balance and harmony, which not just all those, but every culture has some form of balance and harmony. And whether the words we use are the same, we're all kind of talking about essentially the same thing. But why, again, is this important? Because this is important to other people. Despite what you might think of magic, some people really buy into magic, and that's a thing. And I'm not, maybe I mean, I was doing a magic trick earlier with my daughter, so again, but that's something that, human history, humans throughout much of history have believed in things like that and still do. And so again, we need to not put our own personal bias. We have to open our mind and just listen to what people are saying, and then we just got to roll with that because that's what it is. That's what really matters. What are they saying? Who cares what I think? Doesn't matter what I think. What are they saying? That's the goal. Why must we be concerned with the patient's failure to practice what professionals believe to be good preventative medicine? Again, that's the law and order example. Because other people don't necessarily match up with the attitudes and values of every doctor and nurse on the planet. But again, we need to see where they're coming from, then we can talk about where we're coming from, and hopefully we can all meet in the middle. That's the goal, working together. Okay? Um, so, why is there a difference between curing and healing? Again, there's a holistic approach, which is treating more than just the sum of the parts. Treat the whole person. And so essentially that's the idea, is that you can't understand something just by understanding the parts. You have to understand how all the parts work together and interact to produce the whole. Like I can't understand a car just by understanding all the parts. If I want to understand a car, I have to understand how all the parts work together to make the car run. And it's the same thing with the body. It's the body, the mind, and then the spirit. Because that's what's important to people. The quadrants of the heritage chain, again, these are the things you guys need to be thinking about. Vulnerability. Which groups are the most vulnerable? We're all vulnerable, but some people are more vulnerable based upon their socioeconomic location. Okay? Resilience. Again, growing up in poverty, those that don't develop the resilience tend to be more at risk. And there's a lot of studies on this. And a lot of it has to do with teaching children in poverty resilience, teaching people that are of minority status resilience, which is a really interesting field if you guys are interested in studying that. Responsibility. Again, creating and maintaining a healthy person in society are inherent factors that all of us should incorporate. Again, do we my wife and I had this discussion the other day, and I was arguing that it's in our DNA to share. And so the idea that all actions are selfish, I was arguing, is not true. Because I was saying it's in our DNA to share. And a lot of animal species also have this. For example, bats that don't share get starved out by the other bats. So the idea is us working together is built into it. And so a lot of actions are for the group. We do things for others. Society does matter. It's not just about the individual. And it's an interesting debate for a philosophy debate. If you guys are ever interested in, back and forth philosophy on things like altruism. And then we also need to be thinking about consequences. Again, what happens if we don't help? What happens if we turn someone away because they can't pay? What happens if we just let someone die on the street and we don't recognize it first and get some police to put them in an ambulance and get them to the hospital because it's 0 degrees outside and there's a pocket full of homeless outside the train station? We have to be thinking about all these factors. I track the homeless. It's just something I do. I go to the small towns, I watch the homeless, I see where they go, I see the shelters. I walk the cities, I try to find out where they are, and then do what we can. And it's just, it's something I can't take my mind off of. And again, are they homeless? And it was a question I ask all my classes. And then I make them, why are they homeless? And I make them cover the whole biopsychosocial approach, from genetics to disorders to just their thoughts on life and their cognitions, like Walden living in the woods, to socioeconomic factors like how they grew up, their parents, amount of money they had, parents' socioeconomic status, the neighborhood they grew up in, all of that kind of stuff. So again, we need to be thinking about everybody. And, should we be responsible for every person on this planet is, an important question to be asking. Guys, again, just to conclude, we've talked about this a lot, but the system is not fair. Inequality exists. There are disparities between groups. People are located above other people in society. The resources are not distributed equally. Access and opportunity are not equal to everybody. Again, a lot of people are minorities just because they're poor. So it doesn't matter what race, ethnicity, religion you are. If you're poor, that's a minority status because you have less power over your life than somebody else. All the other groups that have less power over their other lives, such as historically African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, Arab Americans, and the list goes on. Okay, they've traditionally, because of prejudice and discrimination, had less education attainment because of access to good schools, because of the neighborhoods they were growing up in, not at the high tax districts, which then results in less job prestige, access to jobs, which then results in less wealth. And then, of course, the amount of wealth you have determines your level of access to healthcare. Okay? Health disparities between socioeconomic groups are real. Okay? So, again, inequality exists. Society is not fair. Now, I'm not saying some inequality is bad because some inequality is good. It motivates you to become a doctor, for example. I mean, if you're not going to have some incentive to study for 20 years, what would be the point? I mean, would you actually do it just for the love of the game? So there's something to money to incentivize people. But, becoming a doctor and the chance to become a doctor, race, ethnicity, religion, etc., should not ever be a barrier, or being poor should not be a barrier. So, again, things that we should be thinking about in sociology. Minorities tend to have lower social class positions due to prejudice and discrimination, essentially. Again, if you're African American, it was very hard to get capital and compete prior to 1960. If you were a woman, it was very hard to get capital and compete prior to 1960. Okay? And again, if you were Asian, they took your citizenship away for a long time. They just said you're no longer an American. They just took that away from you. And Native Americans, we took their land without asking whether it was war or genocide. I mean, again, let history be the teller of tales, but things to think about. So, again, the inequality, the system itself, whether or not the system is a white, Euro-centered system, which you got to ask some questions. These differences may account for our failure to understand and meet the needs and expectations of our patients. So, again, this is the idea of going beyond ourselves, going beyond the system, and looking at people as people and taking care of everyone equally. Cultural care. Again, guys, you need to understand your own cultural identity, your own heritage. That's good. It's good. Those are all tools. But you also have to confront your own biases and our own implicit bias and explicit bias and our stereotypes. Any of that information we've internalized, even if we've never been directly told, we all know the stereotypes about all the groups. Okay, if I were to say name a stereotype about an Asian person, you could do it. If I said one about an African American or an elderly person, you could do it. There's no question about it. Because we've all heard it. Who's better at math? Well, I mean, is that, does the stereotype affect girls' attainment in math? Think about it. How do stereotypes affect people? All right. We need to develop an awareness and understanding of the complexities of the modern healthcare delivery system. Again, this is, it's the entire system, the bureaucracy itself. It's from the education to the certification process to the bureaucracy and administration to an capitalist society versus a socialist program, to who has access to it, to, the spread of medicine across every small town in America to all the big cities. They're everywhere. It penetrates every aspect of where we are in the United States. But again, is our system the best? Do some countries not even have a healthcare system? Who has the best one? Why is it the best? How do we measure that? Questions. And then again, does our modern healthcare system incorporate all the other aspects of culture and spirituality and things like that? Or is it just science, science, science? Things to think about. Develop a keen awareness of the socialization process. Again, guys, you are all socialized into a system, a culture. Now you're being, socialized into a medical system. And each group, each system has its own distinct culture. So, as I said, is the culture of healthcare white culture? When the book said that healthcare providers don't know how to take care of black hair and skin, it's going to stick with me for a while. It is. It's just things like that will stick with me. It gets me thinking about things and questioning all kinds of things. Okay? We need to develop the ability to hear things that transcend language. Again, we need to see where people are coming from. Like when somebody needs something, we should know they need it and be able to anticipate it. And if we don't understand it, we need to go out and find out, how do we understand where they're coming from. We need to understand the patient and their cultural heritage. We need to understand their resiliency. How strong are they? Or did life break them a little bit? Okay? We need to be asking again, who is the patient? Because you're not going to be taught this in a basic intro to social or intro to psychology class. This class is awesome because it caters specifically to those in health and illness, which is a rare class. I really like that we're starting to do this more because I'm starting to, see this going into more colleges, and it's really nice to see, honestly. But again, to develop cultural competency and to really kind of go out there and learn and Discover for yourself. Your book suggests two approaches to the problem. Again, having people work as patient advocates, okay? Um, Accompanying students out into the community. Again, these are just some cool ideas. But again, guys, it's not necessary for you to know everything about a culture. Again, the book talked about so many different things about this culture prefers this kind of, approach to health and illness, and this one has this, and this is a unique herb that they use, and this is a spiritual, um, ritual that they use. You don't need all that. No one can know all that. But the idea is just to kind of put yourself in a perspective where you're starting to pick up that information, but you're also going out and seeking that information and trying to help people. You want to know where they're coming from. That's the overall goal. So, how can you get to people? How can you really get to know them? I mean, I was a restaurant person for 20 years. It's not hard for me to just go out and start talking. And now I'm a college professor. So all you do is talk, talk, talk. It's very awkward because you're always talking to people you don't know. And you get to know them over time, but it's very awkward just standing up and talking to people and trying to figure stuff out. And that's how you're like as a medical provider. You're talking to people, and there could be strangers you never met in your life, and you have to get to know them and find out where they're coming from and what they need. It's a very diverse process. But again, sociology, studying society, is a huge process, guys. It's so in depth. There's so much to talk about. It's a biopsychosocial perspective. How are we going to understand, society, groups of people, and social behavior if we don't understand biology, psychology, sociology, history, economics? And, all of that then flows into culture and heritage and everything we're talking about this class. All right, so the healthcare provider, you need to be sensitive to your own perceptions of health and illness and then go beyond that so you can understand where people are coming from. You need to be aware of the complex issues that surround the healthcare system from the patient's point of view, again, including finances and other cultural issues. I'm not saying you have to know everything about society and all the aspects of every culture on the planet. That's not the goal, but you need to be aware that there are these issues. These issues are real and they exist and they affect people. Race, ethnicity, finances, social class, biological sex, sexual orientation, religion, all of these factors affect people. Media, what they're exposed to, why do people even why are they asking for this drug? Well, I saw this commercial. It's a very complex world, okay? More members of the emerging majority must be represented in healthcare professions. This means people of minority status because white is about to be a minority status when they're talking about race. Health services must be made far more accessible and available to members of this class. So, again, this working class that has been subjugated for a very long time. Okay, how do we balance society out a little bit better? Thank you so much. It's an honor. I hope you guys are getting a feel for cultural competency, just being able to understand where a person's coming from, paying attention to their heritage, which includes all the variables like race, ethnicity, religion, hundreds of years of history, country of origin, being able to look at it from a cultural care perspective of being able to see where they're coming from and being able to look at their needs and, kind of remove yourself from the equation and be able to think about them. And if you can do something like that, we can really help people. And that's the goal. So we're not going to let language get in our way. We're not going to let misunderstandings get in our way. We're going to go find out what people need and how to help them. And that's what makes it great. It's what makes it a great job. So, same thing as being a professor. How can I find a way to get this information so you guys all understand it? And you're like, wow, I get it now. That's the goal. I hope you guys have that experience. So thank you so much. It's an honor.